Deep in the Bavarian Alps, where ancient peaks pierce the clouds and shadows fall across forgotten valleys, lies a secret that the world was never meant to discover. For 8 decades, it remained hidden beneath tons of rock and ice, sealed away from prying eyes and curious minds. Then, in the summer of 2024, a routine geological survey changed everything. What they found wasn't just a cave or an abandoned mine shaft, it was something far more extraordinary. A perfectly preserved time capsule from one of history's darkest chapters, containing evidence that would rewrite everything we thought we knew about the final days of World War II. The discovery would send shockwaves through the international intelligence community, challenge decades of historical assumptions, and reveal the incredible true story of a man who vanished without a trace in 1943. A German general who defied orders, abandoned his post, and disappeared into the mountains with secrets that could have changed the course of the war. His name was Oberst Heinrich von Steinberg, and for 81 years, his fate remained one of the war's greatest unsolved mysteries. But this isn't just another story about Nazi gold or hidden treasure. This is about something far more valuable and infinitely more dangerous. Something that explains why Allied forces spent months scouring every inch of the Austrian countryside, why Soviet agents continued hunting for von Steinberg well into the 1950 seconds, and why his mountain refuge was sealed with such desperate finality. The truth behind his disappearance is more incredible than any fiction writer could imagine, and the contents of his hidden fortress would prove that sometimes the most important secrets are the ones we're never supposed to find. What happened next would divide historians, terrify government officials, and raise questions that some people believe should never have been answered. The story begins not in 1943, but in the present day, with a team of researchers who stumbled upon something they never expected to discover. Dr. Maria Hoffman had been studying alpine geology for over 20 years, but she'd never seen anything quite like the readings on her equipment that crisp October morning. Her team had been conducting routine seismic surveys in the remote Berchtesgaden region, mapping underground cave systems for a conservation project. The mountains in this area were honeycombed with natural caverns, most of them well documented and thoroughly explored. But the sensors were detecting something unusual, a void deep within the mountain that didn't match any known geological formation. The anomaly was located at an elevation of nearly 8,000 feet, accessible only by a treacherous hiking trail that most tourists avoided. Local guides had always warned climbers away from this particular section, claiming the rock was unstable and prone to sudden avalanches. But Hoffman's instruments suggested otherwise. The readings indicated a large, artificially created chamber buried beneath what appeared to be a deliberately engineered rockfall. 3 days of careful excavation revealed the first clue that this wasn't a natural formation. Hidden beneath tons of precisely placed boulders, the team discovered the remnants of a concrete seal, not the rough stonework of medieval miners, but the smooth, industrial construction typical of 1942 German engineering. Someone had taken extraordinary measures to ensure this location remained hidden, and they had succeeded for 8 decades. Behind that concrete barrier lay a steel door, its surface unmarked by rust despite the passing years. The preservation was remarkable, almost supernatural. When the team finally managed to force the door open, they were met with a rush of stale air that hadn't circulated since the final months of World War II. The temperature inside was a constant 38 degrees Fahrenheit, creating perfect conditions for preservation. And what they found preserved inside would challenge everything historians thought they knew about the war's final year. The complex consisted of 7 interconnected chambers carved directly into the living rock. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, demonstrating a level of planning and resources that suggested this wasn't some hastily constructed hiding place. This was a fortress designed to withstand years of isolation, complete with ventilation systems, water storage, and living quarters that could house a dozen people comfortably. The walls were lined with maps, charts, and documents written in multiple languages. German, of course, but also Russian, English, and what appeared to be coded communications in an alphabet none of the researchers recognized. But it was the final chamber that contained the real treasure, a library of sorts, with hundreds of files meticulously organized in fireproof cabinets, personnel records, operational reports, and correspondence that painted a picture of a man who had been far more than just another Wehrmacht officer. Heinrich von Steinberg hadn't simply been a general who fled his duties. He had been a key player in one of the war's most classified operations, a project so secret that its existence had been denied by every government involved for over half a century. The documents revealed that von Steinberg had been recruited by the Ahnenerbe, Heinrich Himmler's pseudo-scientific research organization. But unlike the mythological pursuits that history books often mocked, von Steinberg's unit had been engaged in something far more practical and infinitely more dangerous. They had been tasked with locating and securing what the files referred to as artifacts of strategic importance, items that could potentially shift the balance of power in ways that conventional weapons never could. The general's personal journal, written in meticulous Gothic script, provided the most chilling details. Entry after entry described expeditions to remote locations across occupied Europe, the systematic collection of objects that defied conventional scientific explanation, and growing conflicts with his superiors over how these discoveries should be utilized. Von Steinberg, it seemed, had become increasingly concerned about the implications of his work. His final entries suggested that he had made a decision that would brand him as a traitor in the eyes of the Reich, but which he believed was necessary for the survival of humanity itself. The last dated entry was the 15th of October 1943. Von Steinberg wrote of an urgent summons to Berlin, orders to deliver his collected materials to researchers working on what he described as the final solution to the enemy problem. But instead of complying, he had chosen to disappear. The journal made it clear that this wasn't an act of cowardice or personal preservation. It was a deliberate sabotage mission designed to prevent his discoveries from being weaponized by either side in the conflict. What made this revelation even more extraordinary was the accompanying evidence. Photographs documenting artifacts that seemed to belong in a science fiction film rather than a historical archive. Devices of unknown purpose constructed from materials that shouldn't have existed in the 1,940 seconds. Technical drawings that appeared to describe technology decades ahead of its time. And most disturbing of all, experimental reports detailing the effects these objects had on human test subjects. The research team found themselves facing an impossible dilemma. The historical significance of their discovery was undeniable, but the implications were terrifying. If von Steinberg's records were accurate, if the artifacts described in his files had actually existed, then the accepted narrative of World War II technology was fundamentally flawed. More importantly, if these objects had been real, then their current location remained unknown. Von Steinberg's final act had been to hide them somewhere even more secure than his mountain fortress. Dr. Hoffman's team immediately contacted the German Federal Archive and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, expecting their discovery to be met with scholarly excitement. Instead, they found themselves dealing with officials who seemed more concerned with containing the information than studying it. Within 48 hours of reporting their find, the excavation site was declared a restricted zone by the Bavarian State Police. Access was limited to a small group of specialists whose credentials were never made public. The official explanation was that the site contained unexploded ordnance from wartime activities, making it too dangerous for civilian access. But the researchers who had made the discovery knew better. They had seen the look of recognition in the officials' eyes when certain documents were mentioned. This wasn't about public safety. This was about protecting secrets that powerful people had worked very hard to keep buried. As winter closed in around the Alpine peaks, The entrance to von Steinberg's fortress was sealed once again. But unlike the general's careful concealment 81 years earlier, this new barrier was temporary. Somewhere in government offices across Europe and America, decisions were being made about how to handle a discovery that could rewrite history books and shatter comfortable assumptions about the past. The question that haunted everyone involved was simple but terrifying. If Heinrich von Steinberg had successfully hidden artifacts that could change the world, where were they now? And after 8 decades of secrecy, who else might be looking for them? The answer to that question would soon become clear, and it would prove that some secrets are buried for very good reasons. Good reasons. The official silence surrounding von Steinberg's discovery lasted exactly 3 weeks. Then the leaks began. Not from Dr. Hoffman's team, who had been sworn to secrecy under threat of prosecution, but from sources within the intelligence agencies themselves. Anonymous documents appeared on secure servers used by investigative journalists. Photographs of the fortress interior circulated through academic networks. Most disturbing of all, translations of key journal entries began appearing on obscure historical forums, posted by users with no traceable identities. The leak pattern was too coordinated to be accidental. Someone with high-level access wanted this information in the public domain, and they were willing to risk everything to make it happen. Within days, the story had spread from niche academic circles to mainstream media outlets across 3 continents. The headlines were sensational, but the underlying questions they raised were deadly serious. What had von Steinberg really discovered? Why had multiple governments moved so quickly to suppress the findings? And most importantly, who was orchestrating the systematic release of classified information? The answer came from an unexpected source. Dr. James Whitmore, a retired physicist who had spent 40 years working for various defense contractors, contacted Dr. Hoffman directly through encrypted channels. His message was brief but chilling. He claimed to have worked on projects related to von Steinberg's research during the Cold War era. More significantly, he insisted that the general's artifacts hadn't remained hidden. They had been recovered decades ago by joint Allied Soviet expeditions and had been studied in secret facilities ever since. Whitmore's credentials were impeccable. MIT doctorate, decades of classified research, security clearances that had given him access to the most sensitive military projects of the 20th century. But his claims seemed impossible. According to his testimony, von Steinberg's collection hadn't just contained advanced technology. It had included items that appeared to violate fundamental laws of physics. Devices that seemed to manipulate gravity, materials that exhibited properties unknown to conventional science, and most disturbing of all, objects that appeared to respond to human consciousness in measurable ways. The physicist's account painted a picture of a secret research program that had continued long after the war's end. American, British, and Soviet scientists working together despite the growing tensions of the Cold War, united by their shared recognition that von Steinberg's discoveries represented something beyond normal international competition. The implications were too significant for any single nation to monopolize, but also too dangerous to reveal to the general public. Whitmore described laboratories hidden beneath military installations, staffed by researchers who had signed agreements that made traditional security oaths look like casual promises. The work had continued for decades, producing breakthrough technologies that were slowly and carefully integrated into civilian applications. Computer processors that seemed impossibly advanced for their era, materials used in aerospace applications that officially didn't exist, and medical devices whose theoretical basis remained classified long after their practical benefits had been proven. But according to Whitmore, the most significant discoveries had never been implemented at all. Some of von Steinberg's artifacts had demonstrated capabilities that the research teams deemed too dangerous for any practical application. These items remained locked in facilities so secure that most government officials didn't know they existed. The physicist claimed that only a handful of people worldwide had complete knowledge of what had been found, and fewer still understood the full implications. The revelation explained why von Steinberg's mountain hideout had been sealed so quickly after its discovery. The authorities hadn't been trying to hide the general's existence. They had been terrified that his personal records might contain clues leading to artifacts that had never been recovered. The journal entries suggested that von Steinberg had created multiple caches, distributed across locations that he had never revealed to his handlers. If those hiding places still existed, they might contain items that could revolutionize human civilization or destroy it entirely. Dr. Hoffman found herself at the center of an international controversy that grew more complex with each passing day. Intelligence agencies from multiple nations demanded access to her complete findings. Academic institutions offered substantial funding for exclusive research rights. Most concerning of all, private collectors and corporate entities began making inquiries that seemed to suggest they knew far more about von Steinberg's work than any civilian should. The situation escalated when Hoffman's research notes were stolen from her university office. The break-in was professional, leaving no trace of forced entry and targeting only materials related to the Alpine discovery. Campus security cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned during the precise window when the theft occurred. The message was clear. Someone with significant resources and capabilities was willing to take extreme measures to control information about von Steinberg's legacy. 3 days after the theft, Hoffman received an unexpected visitor. The woman who appeared at her office door introduced herself as Sarah Chen, a representative of what she described as an international research consortium. Chen's credentials were vague but impressive, suggesting connections to organizations that operated above normal governmental oversight. Her proposal was both generous and terrifying. The consortium wanted to fund a comprehensive expedition to locate von Steinberg's remaining caches. They had resources that dwarfed anything available through normal academic channels. Satellite imaging systems, ground-penetrating radar arrays, and archaeological teams that could work in complete secrecy. More importantly, they claimed to have access to documents that could narrow the search areas significantly. Documents that officially didn't exist, obtained through channels that Chen declined to specify. The offer came with conditions that made Hoffman's blood run cold. Complete information sharing with the consortium's researchers. Exclusive publication rights for any discoveries. Most disturbing of all, agreement to submit all findings to a review board that would determine what information could be released to the scientific community. Chen made it clear that this wasn't a negotiation. Other teams were already searching for von Steinberg's hidden sites, and some of them had motivations that were far from scientific. Hoffman's refusal was immediate and absolute, but Chen's parting words suggested that her decision might not be final. The consortium would continue their search with or without academic cooperation. They had the resources, the technology, and most importantly, the determination to succeed. The only question was whether legitimate researchers would have any influence over how von Steinberg's discoveries were ultimately utilized. The physicist Whitmore's warnings proved prophetic. Within weeks of Chen's visit, seismic monitoring stations across the Alpine region began detecting unusual activity. Not earthquakes or natural geological events, but the systematic excavation work that suggested large-scale underground operations. Someone was conducting extensive searches in remote mountain areas using equipment sophisticated enough to penetrate deep into solid rock. Local authorities reported mysterious helicopter flights over areas that had been restricted since the original discovery. Night vision cameras captured images of personnel using detection equipment far more advanced than anything available to civilian researchers. Most disturbing of all, several experienced mountain guides reported being approached by well-funded groups seeking information about caves and hidden valleys in regions that matched descriptions from von Steinberg's journal. The race to find the general's remaining caches had begun in earnest, and the participants weren't all interested in historical preservation. Some were clearly motivated by the potential military applications of advanced technology. Others seemed driven by commercial interests that saw enormous profit potential in revolutionary discoveries. Most concerning of all, intelligence intercepts suggested that certain groups understood exactly what they were looking for, implying access to information that should have been completely classified. Dr. Hoffman realized that her discovery had unleashed forces that were far beyond her ability to control. Von Steinberg's mountain fortress had been more than just a hiding place. It had been a deliberate trap, designed to surface at a time when the world would be forced to confront the implications of his wartime research. The general had understood that his discoveries couldn't remain hidden forever. His final act had been to ensure that when they were eventually found, the revelation would come with a warning about the dangers they represented. But that warning was being ignored by people who saw only opportunity where they should have recognized existential threat. The hunt for von Steinberg's legacy was accelerating, and the stakes were higher than anyone had imagined. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A retired postal worker named Klaus Brenner had been following the news coverage with growing unease. For 60 years, he had carried a secret that his grandfather had made him promise never to reveal. But the photographs from von Steinberg's fortress looked disturbingly familiar. The maps, the symbols, even the architectural style matched descriptions his grandfather had whispered to him as a child. Klaus contacted Dr. Hoffman through intermediaries, insisting on a clandestine meeting in a small cafe near the Swiss border. His story seemed impossible, but the documentation he carried was undeniably authentic. His grandfather, Wilhelm Brenner, had been a civilian engineer conscripted to work on construction projects in the final months of the war. Projects that officially had never existed, in locations that weren't supposed to be inhabited. Wilhelm's wartime diary, preserved in Klaus's attic for decades, described a series of underground installations built throughout the Alpine region. Not military bunkers or weapons facilities, but storage depots designed to preserve materials that couldn't be allowed to fall into enemy hands. The diary mentioned von Steinberg by name, describing him as a man haunted by the implications of his own discoveries. Someone who understood that what he had collected was too dangerous for any government to possess. According to Wilhelm's account, von Steinberg had orchestrated the construction of at least 7 separate facilities. Each one was designed to house different categories of materials, with security measures that went far beyond normal wartime precautions. The locations were chosen for their geological stability, their remoteness, and their accessibility only to someone who possessed detailed knowledge of the alpine terrain. Most importantly, each site was equipped with fail-safe systems designed to destroy their contents if they were ever compromised by unauthorized personnel. The diary contained rough sketches of the construction sites, including topographical details that could help narrow the search areas significantly. But Wilhelm's notes also included increasingly frantic warnings about the nature of what was being stored. He described objects that seemed to generate their own energy, materials that exhibited properties that violated everything he understood about physics, and experimental results that suggested some items could influence human behavior in measurable ways. Klaus's grandfather had become convinced that von Steinberg was planning something beyond simple concealment. The general's final instructions to the construction crews had been to create facilities that could remain sealed indefinitely, but which could also be accessed by someone who understood the proper protocols. Wilhelm believed that von Steinberg intended his discoveries to surface eventually, but only when humanity had evolved enough to handle them responsibly. The diary's final entries painted a picture of a construction project that had spiraled beyond anyone's control. Workers had begun experiencing unexplained medical symptoms after exposure to certain materials. Equipment had malfunctioned in ways that suggested electromagnetic interference from unknown sources. Most disturbing of all, several team members had reported vivid dreams that seemed to contain technical information they couldn't possibly have known. Von Steinberg had apparently recognized that his artifacts were having unintended effects on everyone who came into contact with them, His solution had been to accelerate the concealment timeline, sealing the facilities before their contents could cause further complications. Wilhelm's last diary entry described watching the general personally destroy maps and documentation, ensuring that the location of the storage sites would die with him. But Klaus revealed that his grandfather had been more resourceful than von Steinberg realized. Wilhelm had secretly copied key details from the construction plans, hiding them in locations that he hoped his descendants might someday discover. The information had been scattered across multiple hiding places, encoded in ways that would be meaningless to anyone who didn't understand the context. Klaus had spent decades assembling the fragments, never fully understanding their significance until von Steinberg's fortress was discovered. Dr. Hoffman found herself faced with an impossible choice. Klaus's information could lead to discoveries that would revolutionize human understanding of technology and physics. But it could also provide access to materials that multiple intelligence agencies clearly considered too dangerous for public knowledge. The ethical implications were staggering. Did humanity have the right to uncover secrets that had been deliberately hidden for protective purposes? The decision was taken out of her hands when Klaus revealed that he wasn't the only descendant of the wartime construction crews. Several other families had maintained similar secrets, passing down fragments of information through generations of carefully maintained silence. But unlike Klaus, some of these families had already been contacted by the mysterious consortium that Sarah Chen represented. Financial pressures and veiled threats had convinced several of them to share their inherited knowledge. The consortium was systematically assembling a complete picture of von Steinberg's network, using resources that suggested backing from organizations with unlimited funding and questionable ethics. Klaus had approached Dr. Hoffman because he believed that legitimate scientific institutions needed to be involved before the discoveries fell entirely into private hands. His grandfather's warnings about the dangers of the artifacts had convinced him that proper oversight was essential. Within 48 hours of Klaus's revelation, the situation escalated dramatically. Satellite imagery detected massive excavation operations at 3 separate alpine locations. The work was being conducted with industrial-grade equipment that could penetrate solid rock at unprecedented rates. Environmental monitoring stations reported unusual electromagnetic signatures emanating from the dig sites, patterns that didn't match any known geological phenomena. Most concerning of all, local authorities began receiving reports of medical emergencies among residents living near the excavation zones. Symptoms included severe headaches, disorientation, and vivid hallucinations that seemed to contain technical information the patients couldn't explain. The pattern matched Wilhelm Brenner's wartime observations exactly, suggesting that von Steinberg's artifacts were already being exposed to air after 8 decades of sealed storage. Dr. Whitmore contacted Hoffman with urgent warnings about the escalating situation. His sources within the defense establishment were reporting panic at the highest levels of government. The consortium's excavations were proceeding without proper containment protocols, potentially releasing influences that had been safely contained for generations. Worse, intelligence intercepts suggested that the artifacts were having measurable effects on the excavation teams themselves. The physicist described classified incidents from the Cold War era where similar materials had caused psychological breakdowns among researchers. Exposure to certain artifacts had resulted in temporary enhancement of cognitive abilities, followed by permanent neurological damage. Other objects had demonstrated the ability to influence decision-making processes in ways that made objective scientific analysis impossible. The materials weren't just technologically advanced, they were actively dangerous to human consciousness itself. Whitmore's warnings proved prophetic when the first excavation team suffered a complete psychological breakdown. Video footage that later leaked to international media showed personnel abandoning their equipment and fleeing the dig site in apparent terror. Several team members were hospitalized with symptoms that psychiatrists couldn't explain or treat. Most disturbing of all, the abandoned excavation site continued to exhibit unusual energy readings even after all human activity had ceased. The incident forced government agencies to acknowledge publicly that the alpine excavations involved materials of unknown origin and potentially dangerous properties. Official statements were carefully worded to avoid revealing classified information, but the implications were clear. Von Steinberg's discoveries represented something beyond normal technological advancement. They constituted an existential challenge to humanity's understanding of reality itself. Emergency protocols were activated across multiple countries as authorities struggled to contain a situation that was spiraling beyond their control. The consortium's operations were officially suspended, but intelligence sources suggested that work was continuing at undisclosed locations, using personnel who had been specially prepared for exposure to anomalous materials. The race to unlock von Steinberg's secrets had entered a new and terrifying phase. Dr. Hoffman realized that her accidental discovery had triggered events that could reshape human civilization or destroy it entirely. The German general's mountain fortress hadn't just been a hiding place. It had been a warning beacon, designed to surface when humanity possessed the technology to detect it but not necessarily the wisdom to handle what it protected. Von Steinberg's final gamble was playing out across the Alpine peaks, and the outcome would determine whether his legacy became humanity's salvation or its destruction. The next phase of the search would push the boundaries of human knowledge into territories that some believed should remain forever unexplored. The consortium's suspension proved to be nothing more than a public relations maneuver. Within 72 hours of the official shutdown, underground sources reported renewed activity at sites across the Alpine region. But this time, the operations were different. Smaller teams, advanced equipment that produced minimal electromagnetic signatures, and most importantly, personnel who seemed immune to the psychological effects that had devastated the first excavation crews. Dr. Whitmore's contacts within the intelligence community painted a disturbing picture of what was happening behind the scenes. The consortium wasn't just a private research organization. It was a front for a collaboration between military contractors, pharmaceutical companies, and technology firms that had been preparing for this moment for decades. They possessed medical countermeasures for exposure to anomalous materials, psychological conditioning techniques that could protect personnel from cognitive interference, and most chilling of all, preliminary research suggesting they understood exactly what von Steinberg's artifacts were capable of. The revelation transformed the entire nature of the crisis. This wasn't about historical discovery or scientific advancement. It was about the controlled exploitation of technologies that could fundamentally alter the balance of power on Earth. The consortium's backers weren't interested in understanding von Steinberg's legacy. They wanted to weaponize it. Klaus Brenner's decision to go public with his grandfather's documentation triggered a chain reaction that nobody had anticipated. Within days of his television interview, families across Europe began coming forward with their own inherited secrets. Construction workers, engineers, even kitchen staff who had worked at the wartime installations revealed fragments of information that their relatives had carried to their graves. The collective picture that emerged was far more extensive than anyone had imagined. Von Steinberg hadn't just created 7 storage facilities. He had orchestrated the construction of an entire underground network spanning 3 countries. Supply tunnels, communication centers, and what Wilhelm Brenner's notes described as preparation chambers, where the artifacts could be safely studied without risking exposure to populated areas. The general had apparently anticipated that his discoveries would eventually be found, and he had created infrastructure to ensure they could be handled properly when that time came. But the most significant revelation came from Maria Zielinski, the granddaughter of a Polish physicist who had been forced to work on von Steinberg's research team. Her inherited documents contained detailed scientific observations about the artifact's properties, written in a mixture of Polish, German, and mathematical notation that had taken professional cryptographers weeks to decode. What they revealed challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of physical reality. According to Dr. Zelinsky's wartime notes, von Steinberg's collection included objects that appeared to manipulate gravitational fields, materials that existed in multiple dimensional states simultaneously, and devices that seemed to draw energy directly from the quantum vacuum. Most disturbing of all, several artifacts demonstrated what the physicists described as consciousness resonance, responding to human thoughts and emotions in ways that suggested some form of artificial intelligence or extra-dimensional awareness. The documents described experiments that had produced results impossible under conventional physics. Objects that had changed their molecular structure in response to observation. Energy fields that had strengthened when exposed to human creativity and weakened when subjected to aggressive investigation. Most remarkably, materials that had begun exhibiting new properties after prolonged contact with researchers, as if they were learning and adapting to human interaction. Dr. Zelinsky's grandfather had become convinced that the artifacts weren't simply advanced technology from an unknown source. They represented something that challenged the basic assumptions underlying human science and philosophy. His final notes suggested that von Steinberg himself had reached similar conclusions, recognizing that his discoveries posed questions that humanity might not be prepared to answer for centuries. The physicist's observations explained why von Steinberg had chosen such extreme measures to conceal his findings. The general hadn't been protecting military secrets or advanced weapons. He had been safeguarding discoveries that could fundamentally alter human consciousness and perception of reality. The artifacts weren't just dangerous because of their technological capabilities. They were dangerous because they forced anyone who encountered them to confront the possibility that everything humanity believed about the universe was incomplete or entirely wrong. Emergency sessions were convened at the highest levels of international government as officials struggled to comprehend the scope of what they were dealing with. The initial assumption had been that von Steinberg's artifacts represented some form of advanced Nazi research, possibly based on captured Allied technology or theoretical breakthroughs achieved under wartime pressure. But the accumulated evidence pointed toward something far more extraordinary and terrifying. Intelligence analysts began investigating historical reports that had been dismissed as wartime propaganda or psychological warfare, accounts of strange phenomena observed during the final months of the war, unexplained technological capabilities demonstrated by German forces in isolated incidents. Most significantly, reports from Allied interrogators who had noted unusual psychological effects among prisoners who had worked on classified German projects. The pattern that emerged suggested that von Steinberg's unit had been investigating phenomena that predated the war itself. Archaeological expeditions to sites across Europe and North Africa, the systematic acquisition of artifacts from private collections and museum holdings. Most intriguingly, evidence of collaboration with researchers from other countries who had been studying similar anomalous materials before hostilities began. Dr. Hoffman found herself at the center of an investigation that was expanding far beyond her original Alpine discovery. Government agencies were requesting access to her complete findings, not just about von Steinberg's fortress, but about any unusual readings her geological surveys had detected in the surrounding region. The implication was clear. Authorities suspected that other installations remained hidden throughout the Alpine network, and they were desperate to locate them before the consortium's operations expanded further. The search for von Steinberg's remaining caches had evolved into something resembling a military campaign. Satellite surveillance detected excavation activity at dozens of sites across the European mountain ranges. Environmental monitoring stations reported electromagnetic anomalies that suggested the systematic exposure of materials that had been sealed for decades. Most concerning of all, medical facilities in the affected regions began treating patients with symptoms that defied conventional diagnosis. Hospital reports described a new syndrome characterized by enhanced cognitive abilities accompanied by severe psychological instability. patients demonstrated remarkable problem-solving capabilities and apparent access to technical knowledge they couldn't explain. But these enhancements came at a terrible cost. Progressive neurological deterioration, vivid hallucinations that seemed to contain information about advanced scientific concepts, and in the most severe cases, complete psychological breakdown accompanied by what psychiatrists could only describe as consciousness fragmentation. The medical evidence confirmed Dr. Whitmore's warnings about the dangers of uncontrolled exposure to von Steinberg's artifacts. The materials weren't just technologically advanced, they were actively transforming human consciousness in ways that the affected individuals couldn't process or survive. The consortium's operations were essentially conducting uncontrolled experiments on human cognition, using local populations as unwitting test subjects. International pressure finally forced a coordinated response from multiple governments. Joint task forces were established to monitor the consortium's activities and provide medical support for affected communities. Emergency protocols were developed for containing electromagnetic anomalies and managing the psychological effects of artifact exposure. Most importantly, efforts began to locate and secure von Steinberg's remaining installations before they could be compromised by unauthorized personnel. The discovery of Heinrich von Steinberg's mountain fortress opened a door that perhaps should have remained sealed forever. What began as a routine geological survey became humanity's first glimpse into technologies and realities that challenge our fundamental understanding of existence itself. The general's desperate gamble to protect these secrets from both Allied and Axis powers has proven prophetic. Some knowledge, it seems, carries a price that civilizations may not be ready to pay. The race continues in the Alpine peaks, and the outcome will determine whether von Steinberg's legacy becomes our salvation or our final warning. This story was brutal, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.